Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man! Order. Urgent question. John McDonnell.
To ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer if he'll make a statement on the government's actions to curb aggressive tax avoidance schemes in the light of the Paradise Papers revelations.
Mr. Speaker, this government believes in a fair tax system where everyone plays by the rules. It is this government that has taken decisive action to tackle tax avoidance and evasion and to improve the standards of international tax transparency. The UK has secured an additional £160 billion in compliance revenue since 2010, far more than was achieved under the last Labour government. Under this government, the UK now has one of the lowest tax gaps in the world. We have provided HMRC with tough new powers, and in 2015, HMR received £800 million in additional funding to go on tackling tax avoidance and evasion. Mr. Speaker, turning to recent events. Yesterday evening, several international news organisations, led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, reported on an information leak regarding the financial affairs of a large number of individuals. Mr. Speaker, I should remind the House at this stage that ministers do not intervene in the tax affairs of individuals or businesses, as to do so would be a breach of taxpayer confidentiality. However, I can inform the House that on the 25th of October, HMRC requested that the ICIJ, The Guardian and the BBC share the leaked data so that this information can be compared with the vast amounts of data HMRC already holds due to the initiatives that this government has undertaken. They have yet to respond to this request. Nevertheless, since this data was retrieved in 2016, this government has implemented international agreements that have changed the game for those seeking to avoid and evade their taxes. HMRC are already benefiting from the automatic exchange of financial account information through the Common Reporting Standard, an initiative in which the UK has led the world with over 100 jurisdictions signed up. The Crown dependencies and overseas territories are among those signed up to this initiative and have been exchanging information with HMRC for over a year. And the Crown dependencies and overseas territories have also committed to holding central registers of beneficial ownership information which the UK authorities are able to access. It is important to note, and I quote the ICIJ's disclaimer here, there are legitimate uses for offshore trusts and companies. The ICIJ do not intend to suggest or imply that any people, companies or other entities included in the ICIJ offshore leaks database have broken the law or otherwise acted improperly. So, Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the generalised aspersions made by the opposition, the use of offshore accounts or trusts do not automatically mean dishonesty. But this House should be assured that under this government, the HMRC will continue to bear down with vigour on any tax avoidance or evasion activity wherever it may be found.
John McDonnell.
Unless there's a critically overriding reason for the Chancellor not to be here, I believe the House will consider it unacceptable that he's not here to address the biggest tax scandal of this generation. The Minister's response today was the same bluster. He quotes a figure of additional tax revenues which cannot be verified from any publicly available data. He refers to a tax gap which doesn't include the likes of Apple, Facebook, Google and others. He boasts of his government's efforts to address avoidance, yet last week they voted to protect non-DOMs in the finance bill. And last month, the European Parliament accused this government of obstructing the fight against tax avoidance, evasion and even money laundering. Doesn't he appreciate the outrage in our community at this tax dodging? Every pound in tax avoided is a pound taken away from our NHS, our children's education and care for the elderly and disabled. given the chairman of the Conservative Party and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is responsible for, and I quote, administering the estates and rents of the Duchy of Lancaster, has the Chancellor or any minister discussed these revelations with the Right Honourable Member for Derbyshire Dales, and will he be apologising to Her Majesty for the embarrassment this episode has caused her? With regards to Lord Ashcroft, a major funder of the Conservative Party, who contributed its report to £500,000 to the Conservatives in the general election campaign, can the Minister tell the House what information he has had about the domicile status of Lord Ashcroft between 2010 and 2015, and whether he was paying taxes on his overseas wealth? The Chancellor now has an immediate opportunity to tackle tax avoidance. Can he assure the House that in the forthcoming budget he will adopt Labour's proposals to remove exemptions from non-DOMs and secure full transparency of trusts? Will he now also agree to Labour's proposals to establish an independent public inquiry into tax avoidance? Because I tell them, if this government refuses to act, this next Labour government will.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member raises the issue of the veracity or otherwise of our figures. £160 billion collected through clamping down on avoidance, evasion and non-compliance. That is a figure that he will find broken down and indeed published in the HMT's annual report and accounts. He refers to Lord Ashcroft, and I'm clearly not going to, as I said in my opening remarks, Mr. Speaker, start getting into the individual tax affairs of any particular individual, regardless of their political allegiance or whoever they may be. But he raises the issue of non-DOM status and non-DOMs, and he raises the issue of the measures that he and his party put forward in the last finance bill. Can I just remind him of two things? It is this party that has put an end to permanent non-DOM status. And it was the party opposite that sought, by voting against that bill at third reading, to stop that from happening.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There seems to be an extraordinary misunderstanding by the Shadow Chancellor between avoidance and evasion. Evasion is wholly illegal. Avoidance is normal. People who put their money into an ISA are avoiding tax. That is completely legal. What there is a moral issue, sir. And if you happen to be a political party that spends £1 million a year on rent in a tax-exempt company, that is what people are upset about. It's not avoidance, it's morally wrong avoidance. And isn't that what your party, sir, does?
Yeah. My party doesn't do anything. As people know, I don't have a party. I'm just the leader of the Good Order and Fair Play Party, or I try to be. Minister.
I thank the honourable member for his question, which I take to be directed to myself, Mr. Speaker. And it is, of course, for the Labour Party to account for any situation in which their headquarters may or may not be owned by an overseas trust.
Mr. Stewart-Hosey.
It may well be that sheltering from the tax authorities here sums of money greater than the GDP of many countries is not illegal. But I would ask the Minister to agree with me that is precisely the problem. I would also ask him to agree that the Paradise Papers revelations and the massive sums involved now offer no hiding place for those who would deny a public register of beneficial ownership of funds and trusts as well as businesses. This tax avoidance is a driver of global inequality which runs to the very top of business, politics, entertainment and the establishment in many countries. But these papers also shine a light on the hidden ownership of large corporations by foreign state institutions and individuals. So I hope the Minister will agree with me finally that to allow the public, customers and small investors to know who is really behind the most trusted of brands, the government now throw their weight not simply behind local but global transparency of the beneficial ownership of businesses through offshore trusts, funds and other opaque devices.
Well, the honourable member will know that this government has been at the forefront of clamping down on international tax avoidance and evasion and non-compliance through the OECD's base erosion and profit shifting project that we've been in the vanguard of, through the work on common reporting standards that we have also been introducing amongst our Crown dependencies and overseas territories. So he will find that we are no slouches on this side of the House when it comes to grappling with the items that he raises.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend confirm that this country is now leading the world on tackling tax avoidance, and how does the action of consecutive Conservative Chancellors compare with the non-action from consecutive Labour Chancellors?
Well, as my right honourable friend will know, Mr. Speaker, one of the measures of how on top or otherwise the country is of its tax affairs is the tax gap. This is at a historic low in this country at just 6%. Under the last Labour government in 2005, it was at 8%. And if we had the level of tax gap today that we had under Labour, we would be £11.8 billion short of tax, enough to employ every police man and woman in England and Wales.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The real problem with all the action that has been taken so far is that it hasn't got to the heart of the problem. And that is that we need to have openness and transparency about who owns what company where, who owns what trust. And there is a very simple action that the government could take without any legislation, which would immediately slice through a lot of the problems that we've seen in the Paradise Papers, in the Panama Papers, in the Falciani leaks and in the Luxembourg leaks. Why will the government not insist that our overseas territories, that our tax havens have to have public registers of beneficial ownership? Why will they not do that now?
Well, as the honourable lady will know, there are many good reasons why, for perfectly honest and decent reasons, individuals use trust. But she will also know that we have made a great deal of progress on the common reporting standards across 100 different countries, including those to whom she alludes, and that we are also bringing forward the registers of beneficial ownership across those particular jurisdictions, so that our HMRC has the information that it requires.
Nigel Mills.
I wonder if the Minister could use this latest leak as a spur to bring forward the publication of certain issues we've been waiting for a while. The anti-corruption strategy was promised for last December and got lost when the then champion stood down at the election. And we're still waiting to know if we're going to have a register of the public ownership of properties owned here by overseas companies. Can we get those now moving forward so we can give people the confidence that our own regime is robust?
Well, the honourable member, my honourable friend, will know that there are several areas that we are currently examining, but he will also know that in June of this year, very recently, we brought in the money laundering regulations to make sure that banks and lawyers and accountants are properly focused in real time on ensuring that corrupt practices are established and borne down on as appropriate.
Is not the Minister worried about the tangled web of Russian money that appears to be involved at very high levels, as shown by these leaks? And will he not agree that there's now a great public interest in having transparency of ownership and getting these registers published as soon as possible? Why doesn't the government just make an announcement that the overseas territories are going to do that and get on with it?
Hear, hear. I've already explained to the House and the Right Honourable Lady that the Register of Beneficial Ownership is now an element within these tax jurisdictions and accessible by HMRC, who after all are the authority that we rely upon to bear down on tax avoidance. As to her comments about Russian money, I've no doubt that if HMRC is able to get the information which it has requested from the BBC, The Guardian and the group of journalists, then they will be even better prepared to clamp down on those issues where they are found to be inappropriate.
James Duddridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In looking at these issues of the overseas territories and crown dependencies, can I urge the Minister to bear in mind states in the US that have worse standards than some of those crown dependencies and overseas territories, and standards need to be raised globally, not just in some of these island paradise states?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and we do need to work internationally with our international partners, which is why, as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, we have been working closely with the OECD on the base erosion and profit shifting project, in which we are well ahead of the pack in terms of implementing those recommendations.
Sir Vincent Cable.
What sanctions has the government taken or proposed to take in respect of those British overseas territories that pursue tax policies that are damaging to Britain?
As the Right Honourable Member will know, we are currently engaged in a variety of discussions with our international partners, not least with the European Union in terms of the so-called blacklist, and we are looking closely at the concerns that they and others have in order to strike an appropriate balance between protecting what are very important services to those particular jurisdictions and making sure that tax is paid fairly and as it should be.
Hugh Merriman.
Speaker, would the Minister consider it's not just a question of countries such as the Cayman, Bermuda, those territories, but also indeed in the European Union, the Republic of Ireland and the Netherlands are regarded as jurisdictions where there may be tax advantages to be set up. So would he agree with me that rather than singling out those jurisdictions, we should just recognise that in a global environment where capital is free, the importance is actually the UK tax structure on wealth, and that's something this government has definitely got right.
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important point, which put simply is that, of course, it is not just the tax rate in the particular regime that is pertinent in terms of the issues that we're discussing today, and as he said, he mentioned the Republic of Ireland, where the rate is just 12.5%, but it is those other factors that we need to be looking at in order to come to those judgments.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How many more panorama programmes and leaks should we expect until we see full and proper action on tax avoidance and tax evasion in this country? And as a starter for 10, can I suggest to the Minister that they reinstate the thousands of tax officer posts that they've cut in Liverpool and right across the country?
This government, as the Honourable Lady will know, has brought in £160 billion in tax avoidance since 2010. It's brought in £2.8 billion of that was in respect of individuals attempting to hide funds overseas. She raises the issue of HMRC, which is going through a construction reassignments at the moment, and that is quite right. That is quite right and proper, so that we have a series of hubs that have a critical mass of individuals present within them, that has the right technology, the right infrastructure, in order on a risk basis to go after those who are avoiding taxation.
Ellen Whately.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the lead the government is taking internationally in tackling tax avoidance, because clearly this isn't a problem we can solve on our own in isolation. Could my right honourable friend advise what the government is doing to use transparency to make sure individuals, trusts and companies pay their fair share to the Treasury?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question, and of course, as I have pointed out a few times now, we are looking at the current implementation of the current reporting standards. We are also looking at various recommendations coming out of the BEPS regime, some of which in fact were present within the finance bill, to stop flagrant tax avoidance, sometimes on the part of some of the largest corporations in the country. And of course, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, that was a bill that the party opposite sought to kill at its third reading.
When I asked officials at the Department for Trade whether tax transparency was required in our trade treaties, they said that this was a novel idea and certainly not something that was included in the text for TTIP. Yet it's exactly this kind of secrecy that lets the rich hide billions while the people pay. Will the Minister ensure that in the trade treaties presented to this House in the future, we demand and insist on tax transparency in every single one?
As the right honourable gentleman will know, we are committed to country-by-country reporting. We are going to push forward on a multilateral basis with that. As to our future trade treaties, they are for the future and for the Department for Trade.
Low rates of tax and growing tax revenues depend critically on every penny of tax due being paid. So what is the position if someone receives a fee, then sends it to a trust fund in Mauritius, only then to receive that money back as a loan?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't comment on a specific tax structure put to me in these questions, other than to say that if it falls foul of our very rigorous disguised remuneration arrangements, some of which were put through in the latest finance bill, then clearly that would be an area where those people involved would expect to receive a hand on the shoulder from HMRC.
Dennis Skinner.
Doesn't the publication of these papers show us that this government is more concerned about hounding those disabled people applying for PIP and ESA and taking them disabled motors away from them than they are concentrating on the real people that are dodging paying tax, as revealed in these papers, people that are close to the Conservative Party. Sort it out.
Well, I'm afraid the honourable member overlooks a simple fact, that when it comes to paying tax in this country, we have one of the most progressive tax systems in the world, with the wealthiest 1% of income tax payers paying no less than 28% of all income tax. And as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, £2.8 billion has been raised from the wealthy who may have been trying to avoid paying their tax going forward, a far stronger record than for the party opposite.
Andrew Bridgen.
Does my right honourable friend agree with me that by far the biggest threat to UK tax revenues is the run on the pound and the flight of capital predicted by the party opposite themselves, should they ever get into government?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. One of the measures that a future Labour government have said they will take will be to stick up the corporation tax rate to 26%, which will do absolutely nothing to create jobs, nothing to create wealth, nothing to improve our economy, and most of all, nothing to raise the vital taxes that we need to support our vital public services.
Caroline Lucas.
What the Paradise Papers reveal about the industrial scale of tax dodging, together with the shaming fact that some of the UK's overseas territories and Crown dependencies are the largest tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions in the world, will the government now drop its morally indefensible blocking of the development of a credible and meaningful EU blacklist of tax havens?
Well, the honourable lady is, I'm afraid, simply wrong, because the discussions are ongoing at the European Union at the moment on the issue of the blacklist. The United Kingdom government has done absolutely nothing to attempt to block those discussions. We are firmly and deeply engaged within them, and we expect them to conclude by the end of this year.
Mr. Speaker, in a world of increasingly global businesses, it is the reality, whether the party opposite like it or not, that we have to tackle this on a global scale. Isn't that why it's right that David Cameron used the G7 as a crucial method to tackle this, and why it's right that we continue to take an international approach?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We seek to move forward on the basis of unity with our overseas partners, and that is why we have played such a full role with the OECD.
Mr. David Lammy.
Like me, 2/3 of British taxpayers are taxed at source. They're PAYE. They just can't understand why anyone would want to put money into a small island like Bermuda, the Cayman Islands or Jersey. The Minister says there are legitimate reasons. Will he educate me? Yeah. What are the legitimate reasons?
Well, as the right honourable member knows, there are many reasons why individuals use trusts, and it may be that I decide I want to trust for my children, and I may decide that I don't want that to be known publicly, exactly the way in which that trust is going to operate for reasons of confidentiality. There are reasons of using overseas trusts where you may be looking at dollar-denominated trading, so you need a jurisdiction in which dollar-denominated trading is occurring. There are a whole variety of reasons, and this idea, Mr. Speaker, that every time the word trust is mentioned, it suggests something grubby or illegal, is just wrong, plain wrong.
James Cartledge.
With the tax gap at a record low, and at the same time with corporation taxes in this country now amongst the lowest in the industrial world, does it not confirm that we have achieved that key balance of a tax system that is both competitive and fair?
Right, my honourable friend is absolutely correct. We have brought corporation tax rates down from 28% now to 19%. They will go further down to 17%. And the consequence of that is that we are now actually raising twice as much corporation tax today as we did in 2010.
Bambos Charalambos. Can the Minister confirm what justification there was for voting against Labour's proposed amendments to the Finance Bill last week, which sought to curb the number of individuals claiming non-dom status and improve transparency with regards to offshore trusts?
Well, if the honourable member is referring to the actual trust arrangements for those who become deemed domiciled as a consequence of this government actually deciding to put an end to permanent non-dom status, something that his party never did in its 13 years in office, then he will know that all is not quite as the Labour Party presents it, that any funds coming out of such trusts will, when they are remitted, fall due to tax by that deemed domicile individual in exactly the same way as if he were, as if would be the case for any other UK citizen.
It's Burkhardt.
Is it not the case that with the Criminal Finances Act 2017, this government has created a new criminal offence for firms who don't stop staff facilitating tax evasion?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that is just another example of the 35 additional measures that this government is taking between now and the end of this Parliament to ensure that we clamp down on tax avoidance, evasion and non-compliance.
Jonathan Edwards.
After nearly a decade of austerity and with living standards facing their biggest squeeze in nearly a century, the public are going to be quite rightly outraged at these most recent revelations. The Treasury cannot run with both the foxes and the hounds on this one. So will it either back ordinary working people or the super rich? Which will it be?
Well, the honourable member talks about us having to live within our means, and it's right, of course, that we do that. And he talks about the amount of money that we need to bring in. What has been most unhelpful is that under the last Labour government, because they were so ineffective at bringing in tax and the tax gap was so high, it has cost our country over £40 billion as a consequence. If they had had the same average level of tax gap in their last 7 years of office as we have had in our 7 years, we would be about £45 billion better off.
Kelly Tolhurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the opposition are being disingenuous in their approach? They had 13 years and did nothing, voted against measures to close loops, and really just confirming that it is only this government which will act to tackle avoidance.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We hear a lot of talk from the opposition, but I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the results of what they did, or rather didn't do, when they had their turn in office speak for themselves.
Mr. Speaker, does the Minister not recognise that it is obscene that rich people should seek to get even richer by salting away their billions in offshore bank accounts, whilst working people suffer the longest stagnation on wages for 150 years?
Well, the honourable member will know that those wealthy in this country pay their fair share. Of the 1% most wealthy income taxpayers, they pay 28% of all income tax. And what was that figure, Mr. Speaker, under the last Labour government? It was below 24%. So I'll take no lectures from the honourable member.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I sat on the Public Accounts Committee, we used to hear about mechanisms like the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich, none of which are UK jurisdictions. Would the Minister agree with me that things like the diverted profits tax will help put to an end some of the tricks that could be used to move profits from this jurisdiction into lower tax jurisdictions?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The diverted profits tax works every day of the week, and it works where HMRC has to step in and sort out those companies who fall foul of it. But actually it works even better than that, Mr. Speaker, because it prevents and deters many, many companies from behaving in an appropriate fashion.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says that HMRC are now seeking to investigate this matter. Ahead of the budget, when I suspect the government may wish to put in some public spending commitments, will the Minister commit to a moratorium on any public contracts going to companies that have offshore trusts whilst this is being investigated?
Well, I'm not going to get into the business of providing moratoriums on any particular matter. The dispatch box tempting the honourable lady as she suggests, but that is not a path that I'm going to go down.
Rebecca Powell.
Mr. Speaker, I wanted to highlight the new criminal offence that we created for firms who don't stop their staff facilitating tax evasion. So for the first time, under the Criminal Offences Act 2017, companies will be held criminally liable if they fail to stop their employees facilitating tax evasion. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that this truly demonstrates this government is taking tax avoidance extremely seriously, indeed has done more than our colleagues over there have ever done?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and this is just but one further example, making employees responsible, companies responsible, criminally responsible, where their employees try to facilitate tax avoidance is the right way to go, and it is just but another measure that this government has brought in.
Does the Minister accept that the scale of aggressive avoidance exposed by these revelations shows that the general anti-abuse rule introduced in 2013 isn't really working, and what we really need is general anti-avoidance legislation so that there's no room for doubt and no room for manoeuvre?
The honourable member talks about the amount that has been revealed by these disclosures, and I assume that he is centering his remarks on the half-hour television programme there was last night. The reality is we don't yet know exactly the extent of what this is going to reveal, which is why HMRC has asked those that have the data to make it available so that we can use it to get on with the job with cracking down with those who may have not behaved in the way they should.
Michael Tomlinson.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister has confirmed that we have one of the lowest tax gaps in the world, yet the party opposite still complains. Mr. Speaker, how does today's position compare with the one we inherited in 2010?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he is right to point up the difference. The reality is that today we have a tax gap of 6%, which is about the lowest in the world. It's the lowest in the history of our country. And as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, if we had the same tax gap on average that Labour had during their term in office, we would be over £40 billion out of pocket, less money, as the Shadow Chancellor put it, for the nurses, for the doctors, for the paramedics, for the police, for the army and the others in our public services.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are some things we do know, and we do know that some large accounting firms are being investigated currently for poor practice, which assists and colludes with tax avoidance evasion issues. Please could you clarify please could the Minister clarify what is to be done to clamp down on those who collude with those who do not want to do the right thing?
Well, the honourable lady, I would refer her to the Finance Bill, which has just gone through this House, which has some important provisions within it to make sure that we clamp down on those who enable tax avoidance, which is the category of individual and company to which she refers, and those are some pretty stiff penalties.
Lord Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend confirm my understanding that the profits of the Duchy of Cornwall are used exclusively for official purposes, that the investment board of the Duchy of Cornwall is at arm's length from the government, and if anyone wanted to question who was overseeing the investment board at the time that any suspicious transactions were made, they could go and see the Labour ministers at the time?
Well, what I would say about the Duchy of Lancaster, Mr. Speaker, is that their accounts are readily available. They are transparent and audited in the normal fashion, and there's had been no suggestion to date, as far as I'm aware, and certainly not in the television programme last night, that any particular mischief related to any aspect of their dealings.
Stevens.
Can the Minister confirm that the latest figures available demonstrate that there are 420 employees in HMRC's high net worth unit, and there are 3,765 employees in DWP chasing social security fraud? If those figures are correct, does the Minister agree with many of us in this House that if the same level of resources were applied to tax evasion as opposed to social security fraud, we would have billions of pounds more for our vital public services.
Well, what I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, is that in 2015, £800 million was made available to HMRC, an additional £800 million, for the purposes of bearing down on tax avoidance and evasion, and that is expected by 2021-22 to bring in over £7 billion in additional revenues.
Nigel Huddleston. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents are rightly angry about tax evasion and tax avoidance, but they're also angry about avoidance of action, as was exemplified under the last Labour government, who talked tough and did very little. Can the Minister remind me, how many times has this government acted, and how many more times is it likely to act?
Well done.
Very good point. Well, my honourable friend is right, and the figures speak for themselves. We know how much we have brought in through clamping down on avoidance and evasion, 160 billion since 2010. We know we have about the lowest tax gap in the world, and we know it's far lower than it was under the last Labour government, and I think those figures speak for themselves.
Jenny Chapman.
Speaker, further to the Minister's response to my honourable friend's question from Tottenham, can he explain why he thinks people saving for their children's future would need to make use of accounts in Bermuda and the British Virgin Islands when my constituents seem to manage it with the use of local building societies?
I think the honourable lady, if she checks in Hansard on the answer to my question to her honourable colleague, will see that that wasn't the totality of my response, and I did refer also to dollar-denominated trading and the complexities thereof. So I think if she checks Hansard, she might be able to answer her own question.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell the House, in the assessment of the government, how many UK citizens and how many UK registered companies have these offshore accounts, and how much money has the UK, as represented by these two entities, got salted away in them?
Well, as he will know, those are not figures that I have at my fingertips, and as he will know, confidentiality arrangements that are quite rightly in place in many of the structures to which he refers, and indeed he and perhaps even the headquarters of his Labour Party headquarters might even be held within one of those arrangements. These are of necessity not fully available to have that particular information. So.
David Hanson.
Could the Minister clarify for the House his understanding of what the position is with regard to non-DOMs donating to political parties in the UK? And in the interest of transparency, would he arrange for all parties to publish lists of non-DOMs who have donated to their parties?
Well, no, there are requirements around transparency in the donation to political parties. And in the case of non-DOMs, the one thing that we have done as a government is to put an end to permanent non-DOM status.
Thelma Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in the Colne and Home Valleys pay their tax in the usual way. So can the Minister explain to them why their public services are being cut, while the rich are using tax havens to avoid paying their fair share?
Well, the honourable lady might know from my earlier comments that the wealthiest 1% in this country pay 28% of all income tax. She should also be aware of the fact that during her party's time in office in 2010, it was down at about 23%. This is the party that is standing up for the poorest and the least well-off in our society, and as part of that process, we have taken almost 4 million of the lowest paid out of tax altogether.
Jim Shannon.
Would the Minister and the Government consider writing a letter to all of those mentioned in the Paradise Papers news leaks to gently remind them not only of their financial obligations but also of their moral obligations to all citizens of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Well, I totally agree with my honourable friend that everybody has a moral obligation to pay their fair and legally due amount of tax, and where it is found as a consequence of these disclosures that some have failed to do that, then HMRC will be on their case.
Karen Smith.
Speaker, last year my right honourable friend with the member for Don Valley led work across Public Accounts Committee for country-by-country reporting, amending the Finance Bill, which I think the Minister has alluded to. The Government can now lead the way across the world, implement that provision while still pursuing multilateral provisions.
Well, the government is leading the way in exactly that endeavour, and as I've said earlier, a very important point here is that we have a multilateral approach to this particular issue, and we are working hard on delivering that.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker.
Nick Deakin.
Most people haven't heard of dollar-denominated trading, but they look at this matter and they see one rule for the rich and powerful and another rule for the weak and vulnerable. Surely the way to lance this boil is to have full transparency, and a transparency that is publicly available, not one where you have to ask for the British territories.
As I've explained, the transparency that we need is we need to make sure that HMRC does get the information that it requires to satisfy itself that the dealings in the dealings in these territories are being carried out in an appropriate way, and that is exactly the position that we are working towards at the moment.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Last week, Mr. Speaker, I met with some of the representatives of our overseas territories. A number of them said their governance wasn't working for them. They have little say over defence and foreign affairs. Is there not a win-win here, where we give our overseas territories representation in this place, and then we enforce tax and public transparency in our overseas territories? Taxation with representation, all equal under the law. Surely a clarion call for all of us here today.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope the honourable member will forgive me if I don't start to opine on the constitutional settlement that we have with our overseas territories and Crown dependencies. But I do make one quite important point that relates to the issue that he has raised, and that is that we mustn't forget that they do not actually have representation in our Parliament, and we therefore have particular responsibilities towards listening to them and cooperating with them rather than perhaps, as he's suggesting, coercing them.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wondered if the Minister could arrange for there to be the publication of full details of the merits of sending money offshore, so my constituents in Hull, many of whom are low paid but pay their taxes, can see whether it would be appropriate for them to go offshore.
The most important message for the Honourable Lady's constituents are the merits of getting on top of tax avoidance and evasion and non-compliance, which is exactly what this government has done, which is raising in turn the vital taxes for our public services so that we can have the kind of public services that are a hallmark of a civilised society.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we probably need time out for a fact check on the £6 billion tax gap figure that the Minister's consistently quoting. And I wonder, can I refer him to the private members' bill that was promoted by the Right Honourable Michael Meacher, which set out in detail plans for a general principle of tax avoidance. You can get round a rule, you can't get around a principle. That's right. That seems to be a solid and sensible way forward.
Well, the honourable member, I think, referred to a £6 billion tax gap. It's not 6 billion, it's 6%. No, 6% of all tax which should be collected. And in terms of there being a general principle or a general rule, there is already a general anti-avoidance rule for exactly the purpose to which the honourable member has alluded.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister recognise that over 100,000 properties in the UK worth over £122 billion are owned by overseas registered companies in the British Virgin Islands and the Channel Islands, and that represents a conservatively estimated £2 billion of tax avoidance a year, enough to close the benefits fraud gap in a one fell swoop? Would they not recognise, though, that that's just a conservative estimate, that a third of properties in the land registry don't even have property transaction data? Would you not think that it would be an opportune moment to grip the land registry and ensure that we have compulsory registration of land and property in the UK and the full structure of ownership and their value, so that we understand the full scale of exploitation of UK land and property for tax avoidance purposes?
Mr. Speaker, this government has brought far more property into the scope of taxation than his party ever did in the 13 years in office. So I really won't take any lectures on that point from him.
Yeah, I wouldn't want the honourable gentleman from Eltham to get uber excited. And Mr. Clive Efford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has set out for us the reasons why the eye-wateringly rich would benefit from a tax haven. But can he explain to me how my average taxpayer in Eltham would benefit from this, and why they should tolerate it in overseas British territories?
Yeah. Well, the honourable member characterises those who are involved in overseas trusts as being eye-watering rich. I don't think all of them are. There are many pension funds, and there will be many who rely on those pension funds to live, and many of them may indeed live in his constituency. So I think this general sort of characterisation of it all being about super wealthy people, all being about tax dodgers, etc., is rather crude and frankly not worthy of the opposition.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 130,000 UK companies have not completed their persons with significant control registers, and not one of them has been fined. Now, if we can't get our own house in order, how can we credibly ask others to act on transparency?
I'm quite happy to look into the specific point that the honourable gentleman has raised, and I will come back to it.
I'm grateful.